My name is Sienna Collins, and if you'd told me a year ago that my own parents would abandon my 8-year-old son just to punish me, I would have laughed. I mean, who does that? But they did. They left Liam, my sweet, sensitive boy, on the cold stone steps of a church because I refused to give my brother Derek $30,000 for his latest get-rich-quick scheme. That single decision shattered every illusion I had left about what it means to be family. If you've ever had to choose between your peace and your relatives' chaos, you're not alone. Drop where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you've ever had to stand up to a toxic family. We lived in a postcard-perfect suburb just outside Seattle, where the lawns were manicured and the smiles were for show. Growing up, I was the reliable daughter. The one who balanced homework with chores, who kept secrets and said thank you even when it hurt. Derek? He was the golden boy. The rules never applied to him. He could gamble away rent money and still be praised for his potential. And somehow my parents, Howard and Elaine Collins, never saw the difference. But what happened 3 months ago? That wasn't just favoritism. That was betrayal at a level I never thought I'd survive. Because using my child as leverage wasn't just cruel, it was dangerous. And it forced me to finally ask the question I'd avoided my whole life. What do you do when the people who raised you become the ones you need to protect your child from? And that was just the beginning. After that night, I didn't sleep for 3 days. I kept picturing Liam, curled up on those cold stone steps, clutching his little backpack, waiting for someone who wasn't coming. And all because I dared to say no to my brother. I replayed every moment, every warning sign I'd ignored. The condescending smirks from Derek, the guilt trips from Mom, the way Dad avoided eye contact whenever money came up. Looking back, it wasn't subtle. It was scripted. When I picked Liam up from the church, he didn't cry. That made it worse. He looked at me with this quiet, confused sadness, like he couldn't quite figure out why Grandma and Grandpa disappeared in the middle of the night. I lied to him, told him they had an emergency. But I could feel his trust cracking like thin glass. That same night, I wrote them a message. One they never replied to. It wasn't angry, it was raw. I asked them how they could do this. I asked if they knew what abandonment could do to a child. I asked if they cared. Silence. Howard and Elaine Collins, the people who once read bedtime stories to Liam and promised to always protect him, had gone completely dark. No calls. No texts. No apology. And deep down I knew they weren't ashamed. They were waiting for me to break. To give in. To send that check to Derek so the family could heal. But I didn't, because something inside me snapped. Not in a reckless way, but in a clear, solid way. For the first time in my life, I saw them for who they really were. And I realized I wasn't the broken one. After that shift in me, everything started to look different, especially the past. I began remembering things I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. The Christmas Eve when Derek crashed Dad's car while drunk, and somehow I ended up grounded for escalating the situation. Or the time I paid Mom's credit card bill behind the scenes, and Elaine told the family Derek had done it to prove he was finally stepping up. I used to excuse it, tell myself they just didn't realize what they were doing. But they knew. They just didn't care enough to stop. What hurt the most wasn't just the betrayal. It was the pattern. This belief they had that I would always pick up the pieces, always sacrifice, always say yes. They never imagined a version of me that chose peace over performance. But I had help. Tasha, my best friend since college, saw right through my silence. One afternoon, she came over, no warning, just hugged me hard and said, "You're not crazy. You're grieving a family that never really saw you." She and Jordan started showing up every weekend. They brought groceries, helped Liam with homework, even installed a new lock on the front door. Not once did they ask what happened. They just filled in the empty space with warmth. That's when I realized family isn't just about blood. It's about who shows up. Especially when everything else falls apart. But just as I was beginning to rebuild a sense of normalcy, a letter showed up in my mailbox, handwritten, no return address. It was from Howard, my father. His penmanship, neat as always, almost made me forget what he was capable of. Almost, inside, just one paragraph. Liam deserves a real family. We had no choice but to teach you a lesson. You're being selfish, Sienna. Think of your brother. I must have read that line a dozen times before I crumpled the paper in my fists. Selfish? For protecting my child? For not funding Derek's crypto dreams while I worked double shifts just to keep Liam's school tuition covered. They really believed that guilt was still a lever they could pull. I didn't respond. Instead, I reached out to Claire Evans, a local family lawyer that Tasha had recommended. I wasn't sure what I even needed her for yet, only that something inside me whispered, "Get ready." Claire listened without judgment. She didn't flinch when I explained what they did to Liam. She simply said, "Document everything. Every message, every drop-off, every lie. They may be family, but if they crossed legal lines, we'll be ready." And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: power. Not vengeance. Just clarity. I wasn't going to let them rewrite the narrative. Not this time. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table while Liam colored beside me, completely unaware of the storm brewing just beyond our little apartment. I watched him, his lashes long against his cheeks, humming to himself, and I realized that my silence had protected the wrong people for far too long. It wasn't just about the letter. It was about every time I had let Howard and Elaine walk away without consequence. Every time I'd smoothed things over, taken the higher road, or stayed quiet for Liam's sake. But silence hadn't shielded him. It had made him a target. So I started writing. Not to them, but to myself. A journal. Every memory. Every manipulation. Every financial favor I was pressured into during the years after Daniel passed. From covering Derek's rehab stint to paying off their second mortgage without my name on a single document. It all went into that notebook like testimony. Claire had told me it could help legally, but for me, it was deeper than that. It was the first time I started to reclaim the truth out loud. Later that week, Tasha stopped by with groceries and sat with me on the porch. She didn't press, didn't dig, she just handed me a cup of chamomile and said, just because they call it love doesn't mean it isn't abuse. Her words hit like a bell in a quiet room. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was awakening. And for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of what would happen if I chose to fight back. That night, after Liam had gone to bed, I took a deep breath and dialed Claire Evans. My hands trembled slightly, but my voice didn't. I told her I was ready to pursue legal action if necessary, to draw the line once and for all. She didn't sound surprised. Just calm. Steady. "I've been waiting for you to say that," she said. The next few days moved in slow, deliberate motion. Claire helped me file a no-contact order against Howard and Elaine, not just for me, but for Liam. I didn't want them anywhere near him. Not after what they'd done. Not until they were willing to face what they'd become. It felt surreal, filing paperwork against the people who raised me. People who once packed my lunchbox with little notes and told bedtime stories by flashlight under the covers. But somewhere along the way, that love twisted into control. And that control had a cost, one I wasn't willing to pay anymore. When I dropped off the documents at the courthouse, there was a moment, standing alone on the marble steps, where I almost turned back. But I saw Liam's name on the copy in my hand, and the hesitation vanished. Later, Tasha texted me, "Proud of you. This is how the healing begins." I didn't reply right away. I just stared at the screen and let the tears fall. They weren't sad tears. Not really. They were release. Because for the first time in my life, I was choosing myself. And more importantly, choosing Liam's future over the ruins of my past. I didn't have to wait long for the backlash. 3 days after the no-contact order was filed, Derek showed up at my building, unannounced and agitated. I watched him from the upstairs window, pacing in the driveway like a caged animal, his hands flying as he shouted into his phone. It didn't take a genius to guess who he was calling. Probably Elaine, probably ranting about how ungrateful I was. How dramatic I'd become. I didn't open the door. Instead, I called Claire, who calmly reminded me that the order protected Liam too. "Don't let guilt manipulate you," she said. "That's their old language. You don't speak it anymore." Later that night, an email arrived. From my mother. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even close. It was a thinly veiled threat dressed in sugar-coated nostalgia. She wrote, "You're tearing this family apart, Sienna. After everything we've done for you. We raised you, loved you, supported you after Daniel died. And now this? You're breaking your father's heart." As if they hadn't already shattered mine. I read it twice. Then I closed my laptop without replying. Because I knew the truth, they weren't heartbroken. They were just shocked that I finally stopped bending. That night, I tucked Liam into bed and kissed his forehead. He looked up at me, sleepy and safe. "Are we okay, Mom?" I nodded, brushing his hair back gently. "We're more than okay, baby. We're free." And I meant it. The silence didn't last. A week after I ignored my mother's guilt-laced email, I got a call from Tasha, my best friend since college. "Sienna," she said hesitantly, "have you seen the post?" I hadn't. But I knew what she meant the second she said it. My hands trembled as I opened Facebook. And there it was, Elaine's carefully crafted public message. A post wrapped in faux heartbreak, featuring an old photo of Liam when he was a toddler. The caption read, "Please pray for our family during this difficult time. Some wounds are too deep to understand. All we wanted was to protect our grandson from bad influences." My jaw clenched. They were spinning the narrative, turning me into the villain, making it sound like I was unstable or vindictive. And the comments. God, the comments. Distant relatives, church acquaintances, people I hadn't spoken to in years, all chiming in. "Praying for you. So sorry for your pain." Kids these days have no respect. Not one of them asked for my side of the story. I sat there, breathless. Not from shock, but from recognition. This wasn't new. They'd always cared more about how things looked than how they actually were. Image over integrity. Perception over protection. I didn't reply. I didn't defend myself. Instead, I opened a blank document. And I began to write every memory, every moment, every truth they tried to bury. If they wanted a story, they were going to get the real one. It started as a letter to myself, just a way to clear the noise in my head. But by the second paragraph, it had taken on a life of its own. The words poured out like a dam breaking, years of silence, sacrifices, and suppressed pain. I wasn't writing to explain myself anymore. I was documenting the truth, not just for me, but for Liam. I wanted him to grow up knowing the full picture, not just the polished version my parents tried to paint. He deserved to know his mother stood up, not backed down. That when lies tried to define our family, I pushed back with the truth. I sent the letter to Claire Evans, my attorney. She'd been handling the custody issues and helping me establish legal safeguards. After reading it, she called immediately. "Sienna, this isn't just a letter," she said. "This is testimony. And it's powerful." Claire encouraged me to file a formal report with Child Protective Services, documenting what my parents did, abandoning Liam without warning, without safety measures. My stomach twisted at the thought of airing it all out in legal terms, but I knew I had to. "This isn't revenge," Claire reminded me gently. "This is protection. For Liam. And for yourself." The next day, I signed the papers. I'd stayed quiet for far too long out of fear, out of guilt, out of hope that maybe they'd change. But silence had cost me too much. Now, I was choosing a different path. One where truth wasn't something I hid behind my smile, but carried like armor. The day after filing the report, I noticed a change in Liam. He sat across the breakfast table, spooning cereal into his mouth with slow, distracted movements. His eyes kept drifting to the window, brows pinched in quiet thought. I asked if something was bothering him, but he just shrugged. "I was just thinking, why did Grandma and Grandpa leave me there? Did I do something wrong?" My heart cracked wide open. I set down my coffee, steadying myself before speaking. "No, baby. You didn't do anything wrong. None of this is your fault." He looked at me like he wanted to believe it, needed to, but a shadow of doubt still lingered in his eyes. I wanted to tell him everything, all at once, but how do you explain betrayal by your own parents to an 8-year-old who still sleeps with a nightlight? So I did the only thing I could. I told him the truth in pieces, layered with love. Sometimes, I said softly, grown-ups make really bad choices because they want control. But the most important thing to remember is that you are loved, you are safe, and I will never, ever let anyone treat you that way again. Liam nodded, but the weight of it all was still too big for his small shoulders. Later that night, after he fell asleep curled up next to his stuffed wolf, I sat in the hallway and cried. Not because I was weak, but because I was carrying both our pain, and I knew it would be years before he fully understood. But I also knew this. Healing had begun. Quietly. Gently. And this time on our terms. The knock on the door came just as I was folding laundry in the living room. Liam was napping in his room, and for a moment, I considered ignoring it. But something in me stirred, a quiet curiosity wrapped in unease. When I opened the door, there she stood, Rachel Cruz. Special agent with the FBI. Dark blazer, purposeful eyes, and an expression that said this wasn't a social visit. "Miss Collins," she said, flashing her badge. "May I come in?" I stepped aside without a word, instinctively glancing toward the hallway to make sure Liam was still asleep. Rachel walked in like someone who had done this hundreds of times, measured, calm, but not unkind. She waited until I sat down before continuing. "I understand you filed a report last week about your parents' actions concerning your son, Liam. What I'm about to say might feel overwhelming, but you need to know, this isn't the first complaint we've received involving your brother Derek or your parents. There's an ongoing investigation." My breath caught. She slid a folder across the table. I hesitated before opening it, scanning the pages. Financial transactions. Wire transfers. Notes referencing my name, my account. My heart pounded as I realized this was deeper than I imagined. "We're working on building a case," Rachel continued, her voice steady. "But we need your full cooperation. Especially since your identity may have been used without consent." I didn't speak right away. Everything I had suspected was no longer speculation. It was documented, confirmed, undeniable. For the first time in years, someone was on my side. Not out of pity, not out of family obligation, but because the truth mattered. That night, after Agent Cruz left, I sat at the kitchen table long after the tea went cold. The folder she gave me lay open in front of me, evidence of what I'd always felt but could never prove. My name attached to wire transfers I never authorized. Loan applications I never filled out. The weight of betrayal was no longer just emotional, it was financial, legal, criminal. The next morning, I met with Claire Evans, the attorney Tasha had recommended weeks ago. Sharp, focused, and with a reputation for handling complex family disputes, Claire was the first professional who didn't look at me like I was just another desperate woman with family drama. As I explained the situation. How Howard and Elaine had taken Liam without my knowledge, how Derek had threatened me for money, how my identity had been used. Claire took notes silently, then said, "Sienna, this isn't just a family falling apart. This is fraud, potential identity theft, and possibly child endangerment." Her words chilled me, even though I'd suspected as much. It all felt like standing on the edge of a cliff I hadn't seen coming. Claire leaned forward. "You're not crazy. You're not overreacting. This isn't just about healing anymore. It's about protecting what's yours, especially Liam." I left her office with a plan. We'd file a formal civil claim, preserve evidence, and begin legal proceedings immediately. Agent Cruz and Claire were coordinating quietly, ensuring everything remained airtight. As I drove home through the damp Seattle streets, windshield wipers keeping time with my racing thoughts, something shifted in me. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was fighting back, with facts, with allies, with a voice no longer silenced by guilt. It didn't take long before Derek reached out, his name lighting up my phone like a warning flare. I didn't pick up. Not the first time. Not the third. But on the fourth call I answered. Not out of fear, but because I was ready. "Why the hell are you dragging the family into this?" His voice was tight with anger, but underneath it, I heard it, the panic. "Agent Cruz? Really? You think airing dirty laundry to the feds is going to fix anything?" I stayed quiet for a beat. Then calmly said, "You used my name. You used my son. And now you're going to deal with the consequences." Silence. He laughed, short, sharp, forced. "You're really going to ruin Mom and Dad's lives over money?" "No," I replied. "They did that themselves. And this isn't just about money. This is about Liam. This is about trust. And it's about what you all did when you thought I wouldn't fight back." I could almost hear the shift on his end, the realization that the version of me they'd counted on, the silent, guilt-ridden sister, was gone. He hung up, but I didn't feel victorious. I felt resolved, as if something had locked into place. Later that day, Claire called. Derek's bank records had begun surfacing. Large deposits tied to crypto accounts under my stolen credentials. Claire was building the civil case while Agent Cruz pushed forward on the criminal side. I tucked Liam into bed that night, brushing his hair off his forehead as he slept. My voice might have trembled earlier, but not now. This wasn't just about reclaiming my name. It was about protecting his future, and for the first time in years, I knew I wouldn't look away. 2 days later, I received a voicemail from my mother. Sienna, we need to talk. This has gone far enough. Call us back. The voice that once lulled me to sleep as a child now made my stomach tighten. I didn't call her back, not immediately. I needed to hear them say it face to face. I needed to see if they still had the nerve to lie with straight faces. So I drove to their house in Bellevue. The same house where I'd spent holidays pretending everything was fine. The lawn was still perfectly trimmed. The porch lights still warmly lit. But everything felt hollow, like a stage scene with actors clinging to a script they no longer believed in. Elaine opened the door, surprised. You came, she said, her voice carefully measured. I needed to see you both, I replied. Howard stood in the living room, arms crossed, guarded. I walked in and didn't sit. What you did to Liam, that wasn't just cruel. It was dangerous. And it was deliberate. Elaine's eyes darted toward Howard, who stayed silent. I said no to giving Derek $30,000. So you abandoned your grandson? You left him alone? You think that's love? Her voice cracked. You don't understand. Derek was desperate. We didn't have a choice. No, I said, calm but firm. You had a choice. You just didn't choose me. Or Liam. I could see it then, cracks forming in the mask she wore so tightly. Howard looked down. And for the first time, I didn't fill the silence. I let them sit in it. I've given Agent Cruz everything. Claire's preparing the civil suit. I didn't want this, but you left me no choice. Elaine's eyes widened in disbelief, but I was already turning toward the door. As I stepped out into the cool Seattle air, I realized something. I didn't need their apology anymore. I just needed the truth to be acknowledged, even if it came with consequences they never saw coming. The silence in my car was deafening as I drove away from their house. No music. No phone calls. Just the hum of the tires against the pavement and the quiet throb of a heart learning how to protect itself. I pulled into my driveway in Seattle just after dusk, the porch light flickering on like a whisper of welcome. Liam was already asleep upstairs. Tasha had tucked him in after a day at the park, and for a moment, I just stood at the threshold of my own home, breathing in the weight of what had just happened. I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't hurting, but because there was no grief left to process. Only a strange sense of closure that didn't quite feel like peace. Not yet. The next morning, I sat with Claire Evans in her office downtown. Legal pads and manila folders lay neatly stacked on the table between us. Claire's tone was steady but firm. We have enough to move forward with the civil suit. And based on Agent Cruz's findings, there may be grounds for criminal charges. I blinked. Criminal. She nodded. Child endangerment. Fraud. And potentially conspiracy to defraud you using Liam as leverage. Rachel's pushing for a deeper investigation. The air around me shifted. I had spent so long being the reasonable one. The bridge builder. The peacemaker. And now? Now I was watching the scaffolding of their lies come apart, brick by brick. Claire looked at me gently. You're doing the right thing, Sienna. This isn't vengeance. It's protection. For the first time in weeks, I felt the beginnings of something return, something like resolve. Not anger. Not revenge. Just a deep, grounded clarity. Liam deserved a mother who wouldn't fold under guilt. And I deserved to live without carrying their sins on my back. As I walked out of her office, the rain had started again, light and steady. I didn't rush. I let it fall, let it wash away everything that didn't belong to me anymore. The knock on my door came just after 9 p.m. I had just finished folding Liam's laundry, the warmth of the cotton still lingering in my hands, when the sound echoed through the quiet house. I wasn't expecting anyone. Tasha would have called, and Claire never dropped by unannounced. When I opened the door, Derek stood there. Soaked from the Seattle drizzle, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes darting nervously like a child about to lie. For a long moment, neither of us said a word. Then I stepped aside, not out of warmth, but because I needed to know what he came for. He didn't sit. Just hovered near the entryway like he knew he didn't belong. I didn't know they were going to do that, Sienna, he muttered, voice low. I folded my arms. Do what, abandon my son? Or sue me after I refuse to bankroll your pipe dream? His jaw clenched, and, for a second, I saw a flash of the boy I used to defend in middle school, the one who always had an excuse, always a reason why it wasn't really his fault. I never asked them to do that to Liam, he said. But you know how mom and dad are. No, Derek. I know how you are. Always letting them clean up your mess and then hiding behind their decisions. He swallowed hard. I didn't come to fight. I wanted to say I'm sorry. The words hung in the air like smoke, visible, but impossible to hold. Sorry doesn't rebuild trust, I said. It doesn't undo what they did. Or what you didn't stop. He lowered his head. I'm pressing charges, Derek. Not just civil. Federal. Rachel Cruz is involved. And if your name ends up in the filings, that's on you. His eyes widened. You wouldn't, I already have. And just like that, the door between us wasn't just physical. It was final. When I closed it behind him, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm. For once, the boundary was mine to draw, and I didn't flinch. The morning after Derek showed up, my phone buzzed with a new text. Agent Cruz, free at 10 a.m. Can we talk in person? I met her at a small coffee shop tucked in the corner of Green Lake, neutral ground, quiet, away from courthouse energy. She wore jeans and a navy jacket this time, less formal than before, but her presence still carried that quiet authority. I liked that about her. No theatrics. Just clarity. She slid a folder across the table. We traced the property documents. Not just the forged signatures, there were wire transfers in your name. And a burner phone registered to an address in Bainbridge Island. All linked to your mother. I stared at the papers. She used my identity for more than the house? Rachel nodded. There's a pattern. Over $18,000 across 6 months. It looks like they were funneling small sums for business expenses tied to Derek's crypto projects. My throat tightened. And I didn't notice because I was too busy, trying to survive. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. I expected the shame to crush me. But what came instead was a strange, empowering anger. Like something inside had finally stopped whispering and started roaring. I want full prosecution, I said. Not just for the money. For Liam. For the way they tried to erase my life just to elevate his. Rachel met my eyes. Good. That clarity, it's going to help us build a case that sticks. She paused. And Sienna? This won't be easy. Families like yours, they don't go quietly. But you're not doing this alone anymore. Those words settled over me like a promise I didn't know I needed. Not because she'd fight for me, but because, finally, someone believed me, and for the first time in weeks, I walked out of that coffee shop not as the daughter who was discarded, or the sister who was used, but as a woman reclaiming her story. One truth at a time. I hadn't seen Aunt Grace in over a year, not since Daniel's memorial. She was the only one on my side back then, but after I shut everyone out, I didn't return her calls. I couldn't. Grief made everything feel like noise, and I didn't know how to explain the kind of pain that wasn't visible. But now, with everything unraveling, I needed someone who remembered who I used to be before Liam was caught in the crossfire. Before my parents twisted love into control. She opened her door in a soft cardigan, her silver hair pulled back in a loose bun. Sienna, she whispered, pulling me into a hug before I could speak. Her embrace was warm, grounding like home in a storm. I cried. Not the polite kind of crying, but the full-body collapse kind. The kind that had waited far too long for permission. She didn't say it's okay, because it wasn't. She just held me. We sat in her sunroom, sipping chamomile tea. Liam played quietly in the corner with a puzzle she'd saved from my childhood. I didn't know what to do, I finally said. They used him, Grace. My own son. She nodded slowly. They always saw you as responsible, so responsible they forgot you were a person. But what they did to Liam, that crossed every line. I looked up at her, the truth clinging to every word. I'm going after them legally. Identity theft, fraud, emotional abuse. Agent Cruz says there's a case. Grace didn't flinch. Good. It's about time someone held them accountable. And Sienna, I'm proud of you. That broke me all over again, because I hadn't realized how long it had been since someone said they were proud of me without needing something in return. That afternoon, as Liam leaned his head on my lap and drifted to sleep, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Steady. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was rebuilding. A few days after visiting Aunt Grace, I walked back into Dr. Rhea's office for the first time in months. The space was the same neutral tones, soft lighting, a faint scent of lavender, but something in me had shifted. This time, I wasn't just seeking comfort. I was seeking clarity. Dr. Reyes welcomed me with his usual calm presence, his notebook resting on his lap but untouched. It's good to see you again, Sienna, he said. How have you been holding up? I hesitated. Then I told him everything about Liam, about the church steps, about the forged mortgage papers, and how Agent Cruz was now building a legal case. I kept my voice steady until I mentioned my parents' laughter when I begged them to explain why. That was when it cracked. They used to do that when I was a kid, I said, my voice thinner than I expected. Whenever Derek messed up, I had to fix it. If I cried, they'd say I was dramatic. If I stayed silent, I was cold. Dr. Reyes leaned forward gently. And what did that teach you? That my pain didn't matter. That I only existed to manage theirs. There it was, the core of it. The emotional training that made me doubt myself every time I tried to draw a boundary. He nodded. That kind of emotional conditioning doesn't just fade. But the fact that you see it now? That's progress. You're reclaiming the narrative. His words hit deep. Because for so long, I thought healing meant forgetting. But maybe healing was remembering and choosing to respond differently. When I left his office, the sky over Seattle was gray, but I didn't feel heavy. For the first time, I was starting to understand how deeply they'd shaped me and how powerfully I could unshape it. The following week, just as the rhythm of therapy and rebuilding began to feel manageable, I got a call from Agent Rachel Cruz. Her voice was steady, but there was an urgency threaded beneath the surface. Sienna, I think you'll want to come down to the field office, she said. We found something in your parents' financials, something that could accelerate this case. I met her at the downtown Seattle FBI building. The cold glass facade of the office felt clinical, but inside, her expression was personal, invested. She led me into a conference room and opened a folder. Inside were bank statements, property records, and a transaction log that made my stomach churn. We've traced a series of wire transfers from your parents to an offshore account in Derek's name, she explained. But that's not the real bombshell. She pulled out one final document, a notarized letter, buried in an old email backup, signed by Howard Collins. In it, he wrote, "We did what was necessary to protect Derek's future. Sienna owes us. She's strong enough to recover, unlike him." Those words punched the air from my lungs. Not because they surprised me, but because they confirmed what I had tried so hard to dismiss, that this betrayal wasn't a misstep. It was planned, justified, documented. Rachel placed a hand on the table between us, not quite touching mine, but grounding nonetheless. "This gives us leverage," she said. "We can bring charges for fraud, conspiracy, even emotional abuse under financial coercion statutes. But I need your okay to proceed." I nodded slowly. My hands trembled, but not from fear. From release? "Yes," I whispered. "Let's end this." The courtroom was quiet, save for the soft shuffle of papers and the clicking of the stenographer's keys. I sat across from my parents and Derek, the three of them lined up like strangers who once shared my blood. But there was no recognition in their eyes, only defiance and disbelief that it had come to this. Claire Evans sat beside me, calm and composed. Her presence reminded me I wasn't alone anymore, not in truth, not in strength. Agent Cruz had submitted the financial evidence, the offshore accounts, the manipulation embedded in those signed letters. The judge read through it slowly, eyebrows furrowed in disbelief. When it was my turn to speak, I stood, my legs heavy but steady. "My name is Sienna Collins. I am a mother, a widow, and the only daughter of Howard and Elaine Collins. But I'm here today because for years I wasn't treated like family. I was treated like an asset, a safety net, a problem to solve when money got tight. Elaine gasped. Derek rolled his eyes. Howard didn't flinch. I turned toward the judge, letting the silence settle before I continued. They didn't just take money. They took my trust. They endangered my son. They made choices that could have destroyed us. And when I refused to fund their pattern, they retaliated. Not with words, but by taking Liam. The judge asked if I wanted to pursue criminal charges or accept the settlement Claire had negotiated, a full return of the stolen funds, public apology, and a permanent restraining order. I looked to Liam, seated quietly behind the glass doors with Tasha and Jordan. His eyes met mine. He gave a small thumbs up. I turned back to the bench. We'll take the settlement. But I want it on record, they don't get another chance. And, just like that, it was done. No applause. No dramatic outburst. Just the quiet hum of justice finally served. After the courtroom emptied, I stepped outside into the Seattle air, cool and damp, the kind that always made you breathe a little deeper. Liam ran to me, arms open wide, and I caught him in a hug so tight I thought I might never let go. Tasha and Jordan stood back, smiling with that quiet kind of pride only true friends carry. I didn't cry. Not yet. The storm had passed, but I was still standing in the wreckage. Later that evening, we sat around Tasha's kitchen table, just the five of us. Me, Liam, Tasha, Jordan, and Aunt Grace, who had flown in the night before. The laughter was light, the food warm, and for once, there was no tension. No walking on eggshells. Just connection. Doctor Reyes called to check in. Closure doesn't mean healing, he said gently. It just means the bleeding has stopped. I thanked him for reminding me that healing wasn't a finish line. It was a road I'd walk every day with Liam beside me. That night, after Liam was asleep, I curled up on the couch and stared out the window. Rain drizzled down the glass, tracing lines that reminded me of everything I'd survived. Everything I was still learning to forgive. I whispered into the silence, Daniel, we made it. Not just through the courtroom. Not just past the betrayal. But through the trap they tried to pull us back into. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming our peace. And Liam, he was finally sleeping through the night again. A few weeks later, I signed the lease to a small craftsman house tucked in the quiet outskirts of Queen Anne. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours. The porch creaked when you stepped on it, and the garden out back needed love, but when Liam ran through the empty hallway, his laughter echoing off the walls, I knew we'd found home. The first night we slept there, I lay awake in the dark, hand resting over Liam's chest as he slept beside me. No alarms. No checking for locked doors twice. No fear that someone would come and try to take him again. Instead, I planned. With Claire's help, I filed for permanent restraining orders against my parents and Derek. We weren't just closing chapters, we were sealing them shut, and I started small, applying for jobs I actually wanted, not ones I was desperate to keep. One interview turned into 3. Then Jordan called in a favor at the events firm he used to consult for, and suddenly, I had a part-time coordination role with flexible hours, just enough to start rebuilding without losing time with Liam. Dr. Reyes encouraged me to write. At first, it was just entries in a leather-bound journal Aunt Grace gave me. But soon it turned into long letters I'd never send, addressed to Daniel, to my parents, to the scared girl I used to be. I didn't need revenge anymore. I needed roots, and for the first time since Daniel's funeral, I let myself believe I deserved them. It started with a single blog post. One quiet Sunday evening, I sat on the porch with Liam asleep inside and the Seattle skyline glowing faintly beyond the trees. I opened my laptop and wrote about the day I realized my parents weren't safe. Not dramatic, just honest. I called it When Blood Isn't Family. I didn't expect anyone to read it.by morning. It had over 12,000 views. Comments poured in from women and men who had lived through their own betrayals, some eerily similar, others wildly different but rooted in the same deep wound. The belief that family should always come first, even when it destroys you. That's when I realized something. My pain wasn't just mine, it was a thread woven through thousands of others, silenced by shame, obligation, and fear. And if telling the truth could make just one person feel less alone, then maybe healing wasn't just about therapy and distance. Maybe it was about voice.so. I kept writing. Claire helped me organize the posts into themes, boundaries, grief, financial manipulation, resilience. Jordan suggested I turn them into a podcast. He even recorded the first episode with me, gently guiding me through my trembling nerves as I spoke into the mic about Liam, about Daniel, about what it means to protect your child from the people who share your DNA. And people listened. I wasn't hiding anymore. I was leading with honesty, with scars visible, with hope rooted in everything I'd rebuilt from rubble. A few weeks after the podcast launched, I opened my inbox and froze. Subject line: I read your post. I think I'm your aunt. At first, I thought it was a scam. I stared at the screen, pulse racing, trying to connect the name, Margaret Carlson. I clicked, my fingers cold against the keys. The message was simple. She introduced herself as Daniel's aunt, his father's younger sister. She had heard rumors after the funeral that I had taken Liam and disappeared, but no one in the Carlson family had been able to reach me. She hadn't even known where we lived. But then a coworker sent her a link to my blog. She read every word, and she cried. I read her message 3 times before I could breathe. She wrote about how Daniel's parents, his whole family, had wanted to find us. That they were shut out by my parents, blocked from attending the funeral, told that I had moved on and wanted nothing to do with them. Lies. Every bit of it. I sat there in stunned silence, clutching my chest like the wind had been knocked out of me. Daniel had a whole family out there who never got to say goodbye. And Liam had an entire lineage that had been erased on purpose. I thought I was shielding him from pain, but I realized now I'd also unknowingly kept him from love. I hit reply with trembling hands. The following Sunday, I stood in front of a modest craftsman house in Newton, gripping Liam's hand tighter than I meant to. My stomach flipped as the door opened and Margaret stepped out. Her eyes locked on mine with a stunned softness I hadn't expected. Behind her, 2 older people emerged slowly, Daniel's parents. Liam whispered, "Is that Grandma?" I nodded, voice caught in my throat. Margaret knelt down to his level. "Hi, sweetheart. I'm your great-aunt Maggie. You look just like your dad." He blinked up at her wide-eyed. Then, just like that, he reached for a hug. Tears spilled down my cheeks. Inside, the house felt frozen in time. Family photos of Daniel lined the hallway, including ones I'd never seen, his high school graduation, a fishing trip, even a baby picture that made my knees go weak. His mother placed a hand on my arm and said, "We never stopped praying for you. Or him. Or Liam." I wanted to crumble into the carpet. We sat together for hours, piecing together the years that had been stolen. I told them about Daniel's final days, about Liam's birth, about the lies I'd been fed and the ones I'd unknowingly passed on. They listened. They wept. And when Liam fell asleep on his grandfather's lap, I realized something I hadn't dared to believe since the day Daniel died. We were not alone anymore. That night, after Liam was tucked in and I sat alone at the kitchen table in Margaret's guest house, I opened the manila envelope I had been too afraid to face. Inside were printed transcripts from the custody hearing, the detective's report, and the final restraining order, all legal confirmations of something I already knew deep down. My parents had plotted to make Liam disappear from my life. They hadn't just lied. They had orchestrated a trauma designed to break me. I stared at the photo of my father signing the fake guardianship documents, smug and confident. My mother's voice echoed in my head from that day. We did what was best for him. Best for who? I thought about every scraped knee I had bandaged, every nightmare Liam had woken from screaming, "Don't let them take me." Every therapy session we sat through together, trying to make sense of the chaos they left behind. Then I thought of Daniel, his unwavering faith in people, his wide-open heart. He never got the chance to protect Liam from this, but I did. And now I had everything I needed to ensure they'd never get near him again. My hands didn't shake when I dialed my attorney's number. "Hi, it's Sienna. I'm ready to move forward with full legal emancipation from my parents. And I want to file for permanent no-contact orders for both of them." A pause, then, "We'll get it done." The fear that had ruled me for years began to loosen its grip. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was choosing to fight back. The courtroom was cold, not from temperature, but from the weight of what was about to happen. I sat straight in my chair, eyes locked on the judge, not once glancing toward the people who used to be my parents. They were seated 2 rows behind me, as per the temporary restraining order. Elaine wore her usual pearls, like the costume of a woman who had never done anything wrong. Howard fidgeted beside her, tapping his foot nervously. Their attorney stood, attempting a weak argument for misunderstanding and familial miscommunication, but I barely heard it. My pulse didn't spike. My hands didn't tremble. I had rehearsed this moment too many times. Then the judge looked at me. "Miss Collins, do you have anything to say?" I rose slowly. "My name is Sienna Collins. I am the sole legal and emotional guardian of my son, Liam. 2 individuals who share my blood, Elaine and Howard Collins, kidnapped him in an attempt to force money out of me. They endangered him, emotionally harmed him, and tried to erase me from his life. Today, I am not here to ask for protection. I am here to declare this chapter closed. Permanently." A hush fell. I could feel Margaret's steady presence behind me and Liam's drawing tucked in my purse, folded into my courage. The judge nodded slowly. "Request granted. All contact is permanently barred. You are no longer legally obligated to either of them in any form." I didn't cry. I exhaled. I wasn't running anymore. I had faced the storm and walked out with my dignity intact. The weeks that followed felt like a quiet sunrise after a storm. No banging on the door. No unknown numbers lighting up my phone. Just mornings filled with Liam's laughter and the slow rediscovery of what peace could feel like. Margaret insisted on taking us out one Saturday to a bookstore cafe she used to love before things got too chaotic. Liam immediately made a beeline for the children's corner, burying himself in a world of dragons and space explorers. I watched him from across the table as I wrapped my hands around a warm mug of chamomile tea. For the first time in months, my shoulders weren't locked in defense. My body was learning safety. Margaret smiled over her scone. "You know, you've always had this fire in you, Sienna. Even when they tried to smother it. You never stopped protecting your son." Her words didn't make me cry. They made me breathe deeper. We spent the afternoon wandering through aisles of books, letting time stretch without fear. Liam found a second-hand copy of a wildlife encyclopedia and hugged it like treasure. That night, he asked if we could build a tent in the living room. So we did, just pillows, blankets, and string lights. And in that small, glowing space, I read aloud to him until his eyelids fluttered shut. I lay beside him, listening to his breathing, realizing something I hadn't dared to hope for before. We were healing, not just surviving, but healing. And I wasn't doing it alone. Margaret nudged a flyer across the kitchen table one Sunday morning. It was crinkled at the edges, like it had been folded and unfolded more than once. "They're looking for guest speakers," she said gently. "It's a local shelter for women, survivors of financial abuse, family manipulation, women like you." At first, I hesitated. What could I possibly say that wouldn't sound like an open wound? But that night, I sat down and wrote anyway. Not the whole story, just fragments. Moments. The way it felt to have my parents dismiss my voice. The bone-deep terror of realizing Liam was gone. And the quiet strength I found in the people who stepped in when they didn't have to. When I stood in front of that small group 2 weeks later, my palms were sweaty and my heart was thudding in my chest. But then I saw the faces of women who had known silence. Who had been told their pain was exaggeration. Who looked at me not with pity but recognition. I told the truth. Not just the facts, but the emotions I used to swallow whole. The guilt. The rage. The shame that never belonged to me in the first place. When I finished, there was silence. Then someone reached for my hand. Then another. That day didn't fix everything. But it cracked something open. My voice had power, and for the first time, I wasn't just reclaiming it for myself, I was using it to help others find theirs too. After that first speaking event, something shifted in me. Not dramatically, not all at once, but like a window cracked open just wide enough to let in fresh air. I started showing up to the shelter every other week, sometimes just to listen, other times to speak. I shared parts of my story, but more than that, I offered space for theirs. Liam began to notice, too. He'd sit on the floor near the front door, coloring while I packed my notes. One day, he looked up and asked, "Are you helping people like Miss Sandra helped us?" I knelt beside him and nodded. "I'm trying." He smiled, and it felt like sunlight broke through something that had long been gray. At home, routines returned, not out of obligation, but intention. Liam and I planted herbs in mismatched pots along the windowsill. We started Truth Tuesdays, where we each got to share something honest, no matter how small. His first confession? "I miss Grandma sometimes, even though she made you cry." That one undid me a little. But I told him the truth. It's okay to love people who hurt us. But it's braver to protect yourself from being hurt again. By spring, I'd started writing more. Not just for speeches, but for myself. Letters I'd never send. Pages I might someday bind. A friend from the shelter, Monica, suggested starting a support group for single parents navigating family betrayal. I said yes before I could talk myself out of it, because somewhere along the way I realized healing wasn't just about what I'd survived. It was about what I chose to build next. It was a quiet Sunday morning when Liam and I finished painting the last corner of our tiny living room. The air smelled like lavender and lemon cleaner, sunlight danced through the blinds, and for once, there was no noise from the past clawing at my peace. He looked up at the wall, where we had framed one of his school drawings next to a small quote I had printed on old paper: "You do not owe your pain a permanent home." That wall meant more to me than any house my parents ever tried to control. Because this space? It was ours. Built not from obligation or inheritance, but from truth, boundaries, and the bravery to start again. I didn't know what the future held. But I knew this. The girl who once begged for her parents' approval was gone. The woman who stood in her place now understood that blood doesn't entitle anyone to your peace. Respect, protection, love, those are things earned, not demanded. Liam will grow up knowing that love isn't proven through silence. That boundaries aren't punishments, they're protection. That sometimes walking away from what hurts you is the most loving thing you can do for everyone, and for those of you who have walked that same line between loyalty and self-preservation, this is what I've learned. You are allowed to break the cycle. You are allowed to build a different legacy, and even if no one claps when you do, it matters anyway, because survival is not the end. Peace is not a luxury. Healing is your inheritance now. So to anyone listening, if you're holding on to pain disguised as love, I hope this story helps you let go. If you're still standing at the edge of a boundary you're scared to draw, I hope you pick up the chalk. And if you've walked away, guilt trailing behind you, I hope you leave it there and keep walking. You're not selfish for choosing peace. You're not cruel for choosing yourself. You are not alone. If this story moved you, please take a moment to subscribe, like, share, and leave a comment. You never know who else might need to hear that they deserve better too.